My name is Giuseppe Antonio Benedetto. I am 96 years old, and the doctors have given me 2 weeks to live, at most. My organs are shutting down one by one, like old machines that have worked faithfully for nearly a century and can finally rest. But before I close my eyes for the last time, before I take my final breath in this world, I need to tell you about an impossible conversation I had 18 years ago with a dying 15-year-old boy who knew secrets about my soul that I had never spoken aloud to anyone, not to my wife of 62 years, not to my 4 children, not even to the priests who heard my confessions for decades. That boy was Carlo Acutis, and what he told me on October 10, 2006, just 2 days before his own death, changed everything I thought I knew about suffering, about loss, and about why God allows children to die. I was born in Palermo, Sicily, on March 15, 1928, in a modest apartment above my father's shoe repair shop. The smell of leather and glue defined my childhood, that rich, earthy scent that clung to my father's hands even after he scrubbed them raw. My mother, Maria Concetta, was a woman of simple faith who attended morning mass at Santa Maria dell'Ammiraglio before the rest of the city awakened, her rosary beads clicking softly as she walked through cobblestone streets still wet with dew. I grew up in post-war Italy, where poverty was so common we didn't even recognize it as poverty. It was just life. We ate what we grew, wore what we mended, and saved every lira for necessities. I learned to fix things out of necessity because buying new was never an option. Broken shoes, cracked pottery, malfunctioning radios. If it was in our home, I learned to repair it. My father used to say, "Giuseppe, in this life you'll either learn to fix what's broken or live surrounded by ruins." That philosophy followed me when I moved to Milan in 1952 at age 24, looking for work in the booming post-war industrial economy. I found a position as a maintenance technician at San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, a sprawling medical complex that had just been modernized with equipment that seemed miraculous to a Sicilian boy who grew up in a town where the local doctors still used instruments from the 1800s. The hospital became my second home. For 45 years I walked those corridors, climbed those stairs, and kept the machinery running that kept people alive. X-ray machines, ventilators, sterilization equipment, pneumatic delivery systems. I knew every piece of equipment in that hospital more intimately than most doctors knew their own specialties. I met my wife, Lucia, in 1955 at a church festival in Monza. She was a nurse at the same hospital, a Venetian beauty with green eyes that reminded me of the Sicilian sea in summer. We married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at the Duomo di Monza, and for 62 years she was the steady rhythm beneath every breath I took. We had 4 children, Antonio, Marco, Giulia, and Francesca, and built a life of simple contentments. Sunday dinners that lasted 4 hours, summer vacations to the Ligurian coast, weekly card games with neighbors, and the accumulating weight of ordinary joys that make a life worth living. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful life, I carried a wound that never healed, a rage that never cooled, a question that never received an answer. Our first child, Antonio, named after my father, was born on January 7, 1956. He had my wife's green eyes and my mother's gentle temperament. He was curious about everything, especially mechanical things. At 2 years old, he would sit beside me for hours while I repaired household items, handing me tools with his tiny hands, asking, "Papa, come funziona? How does it work?" I remember his third birthday with painful clarity. We celebrated at our small apartment with Lucia's family. Antonio wore a miniature suit that made him look like a tiny businessman, his hair slicked back with too much pomade. He spent the entire party examining a toy mechanical crane I had built for him from spare hospital parts, figuring out how the pulley system raised and lowered the hook. 3 weeks later, on a frigid February morning in 1959, Antonio developed a fever. By afternoon, he was struggling to breathe. By evening, we were at San Gerardo Hospital, the same hospital where I had worked for 7 years. By midnight, the doctors told us it was pneumonia. By dawn, my son was dead. He died in the pediatric ward where I would later spend decades doing maintenance work. He died surrounded by equipment I would later learn to repair with my own hands. He died while I stood helplessly beside his bed, unable to fix the one thing that mattered most. The funeral was on a Saturday. I remember walking behind the tiny white coffin, feeling like I was carrying the weight of every unanswered prayer in human history. At the cemetery, while the priest spoke about God's mysterious ways and eternal life, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, but something harder and deeper. My faith itself fracturing like cheap plaster. After Antonio's death, I never stopped going to church. I never stopped attending Sunday Mass with Lucia, but I attended as a ghost attends its own funeral, present in body, absent in spirit. I said the prayers, sang the hymns, received communion, all while carrying a cold fury toward the God who had taken my son. Lucia grieved openly, talking endlessly about Antonio, keeping his room exactly as he left it, lighting candles at church every Friday. But I grieved in silence, burying my rage so deep that even I sometimes forgot it was there. I became obsessed with my work at the hospital, especially in the pediatric ward. I would spend extra hours there, checking equipment that didn't need checking, repairing machines that weren't quite broken, as if by keeping the equipment running perfectly, I could somehow prevent what happened to Antonio from happening to other children. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. I spent 45 years in a pediatric hospital, surrounded by dying children, fixing machines that prolonged lives, while unable to fix the fundamental injustice of a universe where 3-year-olds die of pneumonia. My colleagues saw me as Giuseppe da manutenzione, Giuseppe from maintenance, the quiet, reliable technician who never complained, never missed a shift, and could fix anything. What they didn't see was that every child's laugh in those corridors reminded me of Antonio. Every pediatric emergency triggered the memory of that February morning. Every machine I repaired was an act of defiance against the God who had failed to save my son. I never told anyone about this rage. Not Lucia, who wouldn't have understood. Not our other children, who grew up in the shadow of a brother they never knew. Not the priests who heard my confessions, because how do you confess anger at God Himself? Not my colleagues at the hospital, because what good would it do? So I carried it alone, this stone of fury in my chest, for 47 years. After I retired at age 70 in 1998, I couldn't stay away from San Gerardo. The hospital was my life, my identity, my penance. So I returned as a volunteer, helping with minor repairs and, increasingly, spending time with patients who had few visitors, especially the elderly ones who reminded me of what I was becoming. By October 2006, I was 78 years old. Lucia had died 2 years earlier, and I was living alone in our apartment in Monza, surrounded by 60 years of accumulated memories. I spent most afternoons at the hospital, moving through the corridors like a benevolent ghost, fixing a squeaky wheelchair here, adjusting a malfunctioning bed there, and sitting with lonely patients who had nowhere else to be. On October 8, 2006, I noticed unusual activity in the pediatric oncology ward. Nurses were speaking in hushed, reverent tones about a teenage boy who had been admitted with fulminant leukemia. He was 15 years old. His name was Carlo Acutis, and according to the staff, there was something extraordinary about him. "He's dying, Giuseppe," said Nurse Elena, a woman I'd worked with for 30 years. "But you wouldn't know it from talking to him. He's working on his laptop, talking about computer programming and Eucharistic miracles, and making everyone who visits him feel like they're the sick ones, and he's the healthy one visiting them." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that always accompanied news of a dying child. Another Antonio. Another senseless tragedy. Another proof that if God exists, He doesn't care. On October 9th, I happened to pass Carlo's room and saw through the half-open door a thin teenage boy sitting up in bed, his laptop balanced on his knees, his mother sitting beside him. Even from the hallway, I could see the boy's eyes, unusually bright, almost luminous, completely incongruous with the medical equipment surrounding him. That evening, Carlo's mother, Antonia, approached me in the corridor. "Excuse me, are you Giuseppe, the man who fixes things?" I nodded. "My son's laptop is having problems," she said, "and he's desperate to continue working on his website about Eucharistic miracles. Could you possibly take a look at it?" I agreed, of course. I had fixed hundreds of pieces of equipment over the decades. What was one more laptop? But as I walked away to get my tools, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A strange trembling in my hands, a quickening of my pulse, as if my body knew something my mind didn't yet comprehend. The next afternoon, October 10th, 2006, at exactly 3 p.m., I climbed the stairs to the pediatric oncology ward carrying my small toolkit, expecting to spend 20 minutes troubleshooting a teenager's computer. I had no idea I was about to have the most important conversation of my 96-year life. Carlo's room was on the 4th floor, at the end of a corridor painted cheerful yellow, a color choice meant to lift spirits, but which always reminded me of jaundice. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Carlo's mother speaking softly, and another voice, young, clear, surprisingly strong, responding with what sounded like instructions about computer files. I knocked gently. "Avanti!" Carlo called out, and I entered. The room was standard pediatric oncology. White walls, medical equipment humming quietly, IV stands, monitors displaying vital signs in steady green lines. But what wasn't standard was the atmosphere. Most dying patients fill their rooms with a heavy, oppressive energy that you can feel the moment you cross the threshold. Carlo's room felt different, lighter, warmer, as if the laws of spiritual gravity worked differently within those 4 walls. Carlo was sitting propped up on several pillows, his laptop balanced on a bed tray. He was thin, heartbreakingly thin, with the translucent skin and hollow cheeks of someone whose body was consuming itself. But his eyes were extraordinary, deep brown, intelligent, and containing a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for a 15-year-old. "Lei deve essere Giuseppe da manutenzione," Carlo said with a smile that transformed his entire face. You must be Giuseppe from maintenance." His Italian was perfect, with just the slightest hint of a Milanese accent. "I am," I replied, moving toward the bed with my toolkit. "Your mother said your computer is having problems." "It is," Carlo acknowledged, "but that's not why I asked you to come." I paused, confused. His mother, Antonia, stood and quietly excused herself. "I'll get a coffee, Carlo. Call me if you need anything." She squeezed my shoulder as she passed, a gesture that seemed loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. Once we were alone, Carlo gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Please, Giuseppe, sit. We don't have much time, and there's something very important I need to tell you." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "About your computer?" "No," Carlo said gently. "About your son, Antonio." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the armrests of the chair, my toolkit sliding to the floor with a clatter I barely heard. "What? What did you say?" Carlo's expression was infinitely compassionate. "Your son, Antonio, born January 7th, 1956, died February 24th, 1959, at age 3, from pneumonia. Right here, in this hospital, in a room 2 floors below us." My mouth was dry. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a prisoner against cell bars. How do you know that name?" "Because," Carlo said softly, "Antonio sent me to talk to you." For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was hearing. This boy, this dying 15-year-old I had never met before, had just spoken my deepest, most carefully guarded secret. That's impossible," I whispered. "I know it seems that way," Carlo replied calmly. "But Giuseppe, you've spent 47 years angry at God for taking your son. You've carried this rage silently, never speaking it aloud to anyone, not to Lucia, not to your other children, not even to priests in confession. You've worked in this pediatric hospital for decades, fixing machines, saving lives, all while harboring a secret fury that God allows innocent children to suffer and die." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and unbidden. "How can you possibly know this?" Carlo reached out and took my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so physically diminished. "Because Antonio is with me right now." "Giuseppe, he's standing right beside this bed. He's grown up in heaven. He has the appearance of a young man of about 25. And he wants me to tell you something very important." I was shaking uncontrollably now, half convinced I was having a stroke or a psychotic break. This can't be real. "Antonio wants you to know," Carlo continued, his voice steady and certain, "that his death wasn't a punishment or a mistake or a divine failure. It was a promotion." "A promotion?" The word came out like a sob. "Yes, Giuseppe, some souls are too special for this world. They come to earth not to live full lives here, but to plant seeds of love, and then return to heaven to nurture those seeds from a distance. Antonio came to plant something very specific in you, a compassion for sick children that would drive you to spend your entire career ensuring that hospital equipment never failed the way you felt God failed you." I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. Carlo squeezed my hand tighter. Antonio has spent the last 47 years as your guardian angel, Giuseppe. He inspired you to take that job at San Gerardo. He guided your hands when you repaired critical equipment. He was there every time you saved a life by fixing a machine that would have failed. The X-ray machine you repaired in 1973 that detected a tumor early enough to save a 6-year-old girl? Antonio was there. The ventilator you fixed at 2 a.m. in 1989 that kept a premature baby alive? Antonio was there. Every life you saved through your work was Antonio continuing his mission through you. Supernatural escalation, 1800 to 2500. The weight of these words crashed over me like a wave. For 47 years, I had seen my work as a defiant gesture against an unjust God. Now this dying boy was telling me it was exactly the opposite, that my son had been orchestrating it all from heaven. But why? I choked out. Why did he have to die? Why do any children have to die? Carlo's eyes filled with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the room. Giuseppe, you're asking the wrong question. You're asking, why did Antonio have to die, when you should be asking, why did Antonio choose to come to Earth at all? I don't understand. Before souls are born, Carlo explained, they exist with God. They know everything, past, future, the entire sweep of history. Antonio knew, before he was conceived, that his earthly life would last only 3 years. But he also knew that those 3 years would plant seeds in you and Lucia that would bear fruit for decades. He chose to come anyway, not as a victim, Giuseppe, but as a volunteer. Fresh tears coursed down my weathered face. How can you know these things? Because I'm about to do the same thing, Carlo said simply. In 2 days, on October 12th, I'll die from this leukemia. I'm 15 years old. Most people will see it as a tragedy, a life cut short, potential unfulfilled. But Giuseppe, I didn't come to Earth to live to old age. I came to plant seeds. The website I'm building about Eucharistic miracles will touch millions of people after I die. The example of a teenager who loved Jesus and technology equally will inspire a generation. My death at 15 isn't a failure. It's the completion of my mission. I stared at this remarkable boy, seeing him clearly for the first time. He wasn't afraid, wasn't angry, wasn't questioning why this was happening to him. He had the serene clarity of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Antonio wants me to tell you something else, Carlo continued. Something that nobody else knows. Something that will prove to you this conversation is real. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. On February 24th, 1959, the day Antonio died, you were alone with him for exactly 7 minutes, between 5:23 a.m. and 5:30 a.m., while the nurses were responding to another emergency. During those 7 minutes, you held his hand and made him a promise. Do you remember what you promised him? The memory came rushing back with such force, I gasped aloud. Yes, I remembered. In those final minutes, while my son struggled to breathe, I had leaned close to his ear and whispered, Antonio, if you can hear me, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure other children don't die because of broken machines. I promise I'll fix every piece of equipment in this hospital. I promise your death won't be meaningless." I had never told anyone about that promise. Not Lucia, not the priests, not my other children. It was a private vow made in the darkest moment of my life. "You promised," Carlo said softly, "that you would spend your life making sure other children didn't die because of equipment failure. And Giuseppe, you kept that promise. For 45 years you kept that promise. Every machine you fixed, every life you saved. It was all fulfillment of a vow you made to your dying son." I was sobbing now, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I had locked away for nearly half a century. "But here's what Antonio wants you to understand," Carlo continued, his voice impossibly gentle. "You thought you made that promise to a dying child. But Antonio was already in the presence of God when you made it. He heard your vow from heaven, Giuseppe, and he's been helping you fulfill it ever since. You were never working alone in that hospital. Your son was always beside you." Preparation for climax. 25 minutes to 30 minutes. I don't know how long I sat there, crying years of accumulated grief and rage and confusion. Carlo waited patiently, his hand never leaving mine, his presence radiating a peace I couldn't explain. Finally, when I could speak again, I asked the question that had defined my relationship with God for 47 years. "But Carlo, why does God allow children to suffer? Why does He let them die? If He's all-powerful and all-loving, why doesn't He stop it?" Carlo smiled, not a dismissive smile, but one of profound understanding. "Giuseppe, you're still thinking in human terms. You're thinking of death as an ending. But what if I told you that some souls volunteer to come to Earth specifically to experience short, difficult lives, because those lives accomplish things that long, comfortable lives never could?" "I don't understand." "Antonio's 3 years of life planted seeds of compassion in you that grew into 45 years of life-saving work." How many children lived because you kept those machines running? Hundreds? Thousands? All because one little boy died and broke your heart open in a way that changed your entire trajectory. Antonio knew that would happen. He volunteered for it. His 3 years of life and his death catalyzed decades of good that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend. "But the suffering, the pain we went through, was the price of transformation," Carlo said gently. "Giuseppe, nothing transforms a human soul like suffering. Comfort makes us complacent. Pain makes us saints. Your rage at God for taking Antonio was actually the beginning of your sanctification. You just didn't recognize it. You thought you were working in defiance of God, but you were actually working in cooperation with Him. Your anger fueled your dedication, and your dedication saved lives." He paused, catching his breath, a reminder that despite his spiritual clarity, his physical body was failing. "Giuseppe, I need to tell you something important. I need to give you a mission." "A mission?" "Yes. In exactly 18 years, on October 10th, 2024, you'll be 96 years old. You'll be approaching your own death just as I'm approaching mine now. When that time comes, you need to tell the world about this conversation. You need to testify that children who die young aren't victims, they're missionaries.
that parents who lose children aren't being punished. They're being chosen for a special form of holiness through suffering offered with love. But Carlo, I protested, how can I be sure this is real? How will I know 18 years from now
That this wasn't just the delusion of an old man or the manipulation of a sick boy? Carlo's smile widened. Because I'm going to give you a sign. When you leave this room today at 4:30 p.m. exactly, you'll go downstairs to the hospital reception area. There you'll find an elderly woman. She'll be wearing a black coat and carrying a photograph of a young girl. She'll be crying. This woman's daughter died yesterday of cancer. She was 4 years old. My blood ran cold. And? You'll approach this woman, Giuseppe. You'll tell her everything we discussed today. And when you do, she'll reveal her daughter's name. Carlo paused for emphasis. Her name was Lucia. Lucia? I whispered. Like my wife? Exactly like your wife. This won't be a coincidence, Giuseppe. This will be confirmation. This will be proof that our conversation was orchestrated by heaven, that Antonio is real, that everything I've told you is true. I sat in stunned silence, my mind reeling. Carlo continued, Antonio is here with us right now. He wants you to know that he's been your guardian angel for 47 years. He's guided your hands during every repair. He's inspired you to show up for every shift. He's been with you through Lucia's death, through your loneliness, through every dark night of doubt. And he'll be waiting for you when it's your time to come home. Home? I echoed. Yes, Giuseppe. Heaven is home. Earth is just the mission field, and your mission is almost complete. You've lived a long life. You've saved countless children through your work, and now you have one final task, to testify to the world that death is not the end, that children who die young are not tragedies, that parents who suffer the loss of children are not abandoned by God, but are being refined into saints through the fire of love. Carlo's breathing was becoming labored now. I could see exhaustion creeping across his face, but his eyes remained luminous, fixed on something, or someone, I couldn't see. Antonio is smiling, Carlo whispered. He's so proud of you, Giuseppe. He says you've been the best father a son could ask for, not in spite of your anger and doubt, but because your anger and doubt drove you to love in the most practical way possible, by keeping machines running that kept children alive. I left Carlo's room at 4:30 p.m. exactly, my legs shaking, my mind reeling. My heart cracked open in ways I couldn't begin to process. I had entered that room as Giuseppe da Manutenzione, the quiet hospital technician who had spent 47 years running from God. I left as someone completely transformed, still Giuseppe, but Giuseppe awakened. Giuseppe freed from a prison of rage I hadn't even fully recognized as a prison. I took the elevator down to the ground floor, my hands trembling on the rail. The hospital sounds around me, the intercoms paging doctors, the squeak of wheels on linoleum, the distant beeping of monitors, all seemed to come from very far away, as if I were hearing them through water. The reception area was moderately crowded with visitors checking in for evening visiting hours. I scanned the space, part of me hoping I wouldn't see what Carlo had predicted, part of me terrified I would. And then I saw her. An elderly woman, perhaps in her late 60s, sitting alone on one of the plastic chairs near the entrance. She wore a black coat despite the mild October weather. In her hands, she clutched a photograph. I could see it even from across the room, a photo frame catching the overhead lights. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the photograph. My heart began to hammer. My mouth went dry. Every instinct told me to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen her, to preserve my fragile rationality by not pursuing this supernatural rabbit hole any further. But I had made a promise to Carlo. And more importantly, I had spent 47 years running from uncomfortable truths. I was done running. I walked toward her, my steps uncertain, my rehearsed words evaporating from my mind. When I reached her, I simply said, "Signora?" She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "See? I know this will sound strange," I began, my voice shaking. "But I just came from upstairs, from a conversation with a young boy named Carlo Acutis. And he told me I would find you here." Her expression shifted from grief to confusion. "Carlo Acutis? The boy with leukemia?" "Yes, he told me about your daughter." The woman's face crumpled. "My Lucia," she whispered. "She died yesterday. 4 years old. Brain cancer. I came today I don't know why I came. I couldn't stay at home. I thought maybe being in the hospital would make me feel closer to her." The name hit me like a physical blow. Lucia. Just as Carlo had predicted. "Signora," I said, sitting down beside her, no longer able to stand, "may I tell you something impossible?" For the next 20 minutes, I told this grieving stranger everything. About Antonio's death in 1959, about my 47 years of rage at God, about Carlo knowing things no human could know, about Antonio working as a guardian angel, about children who die young being missionaries, not victims. She listened without interrupting, tears streaming steadily down her face. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "My Lucia, the night before she died, she woke up at 3 a.m. She was very weak, very sick. But she looked at me with completely clear eyes and said, 'Mama, don't be sad. I'm going to help other children who are scared of dying. I'm going to hold their hands when they cross over.' I thought it was the morphine, the confusion of a dying brain. But what if she knew?" I finished. "What if she was telling you the truth? What if your Lucia, like my Antonio, volunteered for this mission?" We sat together for over an hour, two strangers bound by identical grief and an impossible revelation. When we finally parted, she embraced me with the fierce grip of someone clinging to a life raft in a storm. "Giuseppe," she whispered in my ear, "thank you. Thank you for having the courage to tell me this. For the first time since Lucia died, I don't feel like I'm drowning." I climbed back upstairs to see Carlo one more time, to thank him, to tell him the prophecy had been fulfilled exactly as he'd predicted. But when I reached his room, his mother stopped me in the hallway. "He's sleeping now," she said gently. "He's very tired. But he told me to tell you, if you came back, that Antonio says goodbye for now, but not forever." 2 days later, on October 12, 2006, Carlo Acutis died. The hospital staff spoke about his death in hushed, reverent tones, not because it was tragic, though of course it was, but because somehow this 15-year-old boy had faced death with such grace, such certainty, such joy, that his passing felt less like an ending and more like a graduation. The years that followed were unlike anything that had come before. I continued volunteering at San Gerardo Hospital, but everything was different. Where I had once seen every sick child as evidence of divine injustice, I now saw potential missionaries. Where I had once repaired equipment in bitter defiance of an uncaring God, I now repaired equipment in cooperation with a God whose ways were stranger and more merciful than I could have imagined. I began visiting not just the equipment, but the families, especially parents of terminally ill children. I would sit with them in their darkest hours, and, when the moment felt right, I would tell them about Antonio, about Carlo, about the possibility that their suffering had purpose, that their children's short lives had meaning that extended far beyond their brief time on earth. Some parents rejected what I said. Their pain was too fresh, their anger too raw. I understood. I had been there for 47 years. But others drank in my words like water in a desert. I watched hope kindle in eyes that had been dead with despair. I watched rage transform into acceptance, and acceptance transform into something stranger and more beautiful. Gratitude mixed with sorrow, grief shot through with joy. The profound mystery of a love that can hold both loss and faith simultaneously. In 2016, I developed prostate cancer. It was aggressive, and the doctors gave me various treatments that bought me time, but not a cure. I was 88 years old. I had lived a long life. I was ready. But apparently, heaven wasn't quite ready for me yet. In 2017, against all medical expectations, the cancer went into remission. My doctors were baffled. I wasn't. I had a mission to complete. Carlo had given me a date, October 10th, 2024. 18 years from our conversation. I had to live until then. In 2020, something extraordinary happened. On October 10th, exactly 14 years after my conversation with Carlo, he was beatified in Assisi. Blessed Carlo Acutis. The news spread around the world. The first millennial to be beatified. The patron saint of the Internet. The teenage boy who had loved Jesus and computer programming with equal passion. I watched the ceremony on television, tears streaming down my face. There he was, Carlo, his face in photographs, his story being told to millions. And I alone knew a piece of his story that the world didn't yet know. That in his final days, he had been visited by angels, that he had carried messages from the dead to the living, that he had cracked open the heart of one stubborn old man who had spent nearly 5 decades angry at God. I began to prepare my testimony. I wrote it down, revised it, made sure every detail was exact. I had to live long enough to fulfill Carlo's prophecy, to complete the mission he had given me. In 2023, my health began to decline more seriously. Heart problems, kidney problems, the accumulated failures of a body that had been working faithfully for over 9 decades. My children wanted me to move in with one of them, but I insisted on staying in my small apartment in Monza, the place where Lucia and I had raised our family, the place where Antonio's room still held a few of his old toys. By September 2024, I knew the end was close. The doctors gave me months at most, but I only needed weeks. I only needed to reach October 10th, and now here I am, October 10th, 2024. Exactly 18 years since Carlo Acutis told me to wait for this day. I am 96 years old. My organs are shutting down. The doctors have given me 2 weeks, perhaps less. But I fulfilled my promise. This testimony will reach the world. Carlo's prophecy has been completed to the letter. In these final days, lying in my bed in the same city where I spent my entire adult life, I find myself thinking about missions and purposes and the strange economy of divine love. I think about Antonio, my little boy who died at 3 and has spent 65 years as an angel. I think about Carlo, who died at 15 and has spent 18 years planting seeds that will bloom for generations. I think about all the children I met in my decades at San Gerardo, some who lived, some who died, all of whom were part of a story much larger than I understood at the time. I think about that grieving mother in the hospital reception area, clutching a photo of her daughter Lucia. I wonder where she is now, whether she found peace, whether she's been able to see her daughter's death as Carlo helped me see Antonio's, not as a tragic ending, but as a glorious beginning. I think about my own children, Marco, Julia, and Francesca, and my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who will carry forward a legacy they don't fully understand. They know I worked at a hospital. They don't know I spent my career in collaboration with an angel I couldn't see. Most of all, I think about forgiveness. For 47 years, I was angry at God for taking Antonio. It never occurred to me that God didn't take Antonio. Antonio volunteered. It never occurred to me that my son's short life was more productive, more meaningful, more eternally significant than most people's long lives. It never occurred to me that the rage I carried was slowly, mysteriously being transformed into love. The kind of love that shows up for work every day for 45 years to keep machines running that keep children alive. Carlo told me that Antonio has been beside me all these years. I believe him. In my final days, I've begun to feel my son's presence more tangibly, not as a 3-year-old with green eyes, but as the 25-year-old angel he's become, waiting patiently to welcome me home. If you're listening to this testimony, if these words have reached you somehow, perhaps you're someone who has lost a child. Perhaps you're someone who is angry at God for allowing suffering. Perhaps you're someone who sees the death of the young as proof that the universe is cruel and meaningless. I can't tell you what to believe. I can only tell you what I know. That on October 10th, 2006, a dying 15-year-old boy told me things no living human could have known. That he gave me a prophecy that was fulfilled exactly as he predicted. That he revealed a truth that transformed 47 years of rage into 18 years of peace. Children who die young are not tragedies. They are missionaries. Parents who lose children are not being punished. They are being refined into saints through the fire of sacrificial love. And death is not the end. It is merely the completion of one mission and the beginning of another. In a few days, perhaps a week, I will close my eyes for the last time in this world. And when I do, Antonio will be waiting. Not as the 3-year-old I lost in 1959, but as the angel he's become. Carlo will be there too, I think. Blessed Carlo. Still 15 years old, still wearing his sneakers, still smiling with that joy that doesn't make sense unless you understand that death is not defeat, but victory. I've spent 96 years in this body.
I've repaired countless machines.
I've saved lives I'll never know about. I've carried rage and found peace. I've lost love and discovered it again in stranger, holier forms. And now, finally, I'm ready to go home. Antonio, I kept my promise. Every machine I fixed, every child who lived because equipment didn't fail, it was all for you. All of it. Carlo, I kept your promise too. 18 years, just as you asked. This testimony will reach the world. And to anyone hearing this who has buried a child, who has raged at God, who has wondered if there's any meaning in suffering, there is. I promise you, there is. Your pain is not wasted. Your child is not gone. And the God you're angry at is closer than you know, working in ways too strange and merciful for human minds to fully comprehend. May blessed Carlo Acutis intercede for all parents who grieve. May he help us understand that some souls are too bright to stay long in this dark world. May he teach us that death is not the end of love, but its transformation into something eternal. And may we all, when our time comes, cross over with the same joy Carlo showed, the joy of a mission completed, a race finished, a life offered as a seed that will bloom in gardens we'll never see with earthly eyes. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.